They had ordered one of those big cakes, with layers, white frosting, edible gold trim, and flowers I would never have picked myself. It was the kind of cake people take photos of, instead of tasting. Everyone gathered around, waiting for me to blow out the candles, 25 people at least. The room echoed with that strange tone of practice celebration cheers clapping someone recording on a phone. I smiled, of course I did, because I had learned how to smile in rooms that made my soul ache. At 75, I suppose you become fluent in quiet endurance. But somewhere between the cake being cut and the speeches being made, I felt it, that cold, hollow echo inside me. Like I was watching my own party from far away, a ghost at her own table. I remember thinking, when did it become like this? When did I become someone to be managed, celebrated out of duty, parked at the head of the table, like a relic on display? My children were there, yes, with their busy eyes and performative gratitude. My grandchildren, too, though most of them were glued to screens or checking their watches. And him, my husband, he stood at the center like he always did, giving toasts with that familiar emptiness in his voice, saying just enough to appear present, while giving nothing that cost effort. He had never been one for depth, always just enough. It should have been a moment of love, right? 75 years alive, 53 years married, a lifetime of giving. But all I could feel was the heaviness in my chest and the ache in my legs as I sat there surrounded by people I had poured myself into, who no longer saw me as a person, but a fixture, a mother, a grandmother, a wife, a role to applaud and then forget about until the next family gathering. The oddest thing is I wasn't even surprised. I think I had known for years that something was broken, but birthdays, especially the big ones, have a way of holding up mirrors, and this one reflected back everything I didn't want to see. It wasn't the wrinkles or the gray hair that hurt. It was the realization that the people I had held closest had slowly stopped holding me back. I wasn't essential anymore. I was expected. Later that evening, as I cleared plates no one offered to help with, I stood in the kitchen with my hands deep in sudsy water. I could hear them laughing in the next room, talking about work plans the drive home. My absence didn't seem to interrupt anything. I looked out the small kitchen window and the night was calm, stars scattered like sugar across a dark tablecloth, and I felt something crack, not loudly, not violently. Just a soft, unmistakable break, like a thread finally snapping after too many years of holding everything together. It had been building for a long time, I think. The missed thank yous, the unspoken assumptions, the way my husband would pat my shoulder instead of truly looking at me. It was in the way my kids asked how I was doing but didn't really want an answer, unless it was, I'm fine. It was in how my needs had become background noise to the endless demands of being everyone's constant. I had become the keeper of traditions, the memory holder, the holiday organizer, the financial safety net, everything but someone to be cherished. They meant well, I don't doubt that. Most people do. But meaning well and seeing someone are not the same thing. And in that moment, as the dishwasher hummed behind me and voices drifted like wallpaper patterns through the walls, I knew something needed to change. Not for them, oh no. For me. For the part of me that had been slowly fading like a photograph left too long in the sun. I didn't know what form that change would take, not yet. But I remember drying my hands on the dish towel walking back into that room, with the cake now half-eaten, and the music turned up, and realizing that if this was the celebration of my life, then I wanted no more celebrations like this. I wanted no more spaces where I had to shrink to make others comfortable. I wanted no more years of bending myself to accommodate people who only saw the version of me that served their needs. The night ended like most nights do in families. Hugs at the door, promises to call bags, collected leftovers wrapped. My husband kissed my cheek like it was a habit, not a moment, and I stood there smiling like I always did. But something had shifted inside me, something I couldn't put back. And as I turned off the lights one by one, I whispered a sentence to the dark kitchen that surprised even me. This was the last time I let them think I owed them anything. He handed it to me after everyone had finished their cake. A slim box, long and flat, wrapped in a ribbon that someone else clearly tied. He smiled like he always did, just enough to convince a room, never enough to convince me. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he said, and I took the box with both hands, careful not to let the trembling show. I'd hoped for something, anything that showed he knew me, that after all these years he'd remember what made me feel seen. I opened it slowly, savoring the moment, because I wanted to believe just for one breath that there was something thoughtful inside. It was a necklace, a generic gold chain with a heart-shaped pendant that looked like it came from a department store window. No engraving, no story, no soul. I turned it over in my hand, searching for something, his handwriting, a date, even a note tucked inside the box. But there was nothing, just that cold little trinket staring back at me like a symbol of all the empty gestures that had come before it. I smiled anyway. Of course I did. My children were watching. My grandchildren clapped. My husband looked proud, as if he'd just presented me with an heirloom. And inside I felt that slow, familiar sinking, that ache that comes not from being hurt, but from realizing someone never really tried. For decades I had given him gifts that meant something. The watch he still wears, engraved with our anniversary date. The first edition book he once cried over. The hand-knit sweater in his college colors, which I made when we barely had money for food. He used to say those things made him feel seen. And now this necklace, shiny, pretty, thoughtless. I wore it through the rest of the night like a badge of pretend. It sat on my chest like a weight. Every time someone complimented it, I nodded and said, "Yes, it's from him," and wondered how many women over the years had worn gifts like these, nice on the outside, hollow inside. He never noticed my silence. He never noticed that I didn't touch him once after opening it, that I didn't reach for his hand or lean on his shoulder like I might have in years past. He was too busy being the charming host, making jokes that fell flat, pouring drinks no one asked for, reminding everyone how young I still looked. And I thought back to all the birthdays before this one, the year I turned 40 and made my own cake because he forgot, the year I turned 50 and he gave me a treadmill because he thought I'd feel better with some tone, the year I turned 60 and he left for a golf weekend with his friends, came back with sunburned arms and an apology wrapped in flowers he grabbed from a gas station. I'd swallowed those hurts one by one because I believed marriage meant endurance, that one day he'd see all the ways I loved him and mirror it back. But there is a grief that builds when you are constantly giving without return. It's not a sharp pain. It's slow like a roof leak. You don't notice until the ceiling caves in. And this birthday, this was the ceiling collapsing. That night, after the guests left and he'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the dining room. The table was a mess, crumbs half drunk, glasses, crumpled napkins, and I just stared at that necklace on the placemat. I'd taken it off as soon as no one was looking. It didn't feel like mine. It felt like an apology without words, a stand-in for attention, for care, for partnership. And for the first time in a very long while, I let myself cry, not because of the necklace, but because of the pattern it represented. Because I realized I had spent most of my life hoping he would show up differently, and he never had. In the morning, he asked me how I slept. I said fine, as I always did. He didn't press further. He never did. And when he asked why I wasn't wearing the necklace, I told him I was saving it for something special. He smiled and nodded, unaware that I meant something else entirely, saving myself for something special. Not another party, not another performative gesture, but a moment where I could reclaim the pieces of me I'd given away year after year, gift after gift, smile after smile. I began to feel it then, that small ember of resolve. I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but I knew this much: I was done pretending, done accepting less and calling it enough. The necklace in all its glittering emptiness had opened a door I had kept locked for too long, and once that door opened, I wasn't going to close it again. It's strange how clearly you can remember the moments no one else does, the ones where you stood behind the curtain making sure the show went on. I don't think my husband ever noticed how the towels were always folded just right, or how the pantry never emptied, or how his socks were magically reunited with their pairs each week. I think he thought the house ran on luck, or worse, that it ran on love alone. But love without labor is just convenience, and I was the labor. I was the unthanked hands behind every comfort he enjoyed. I was the woman who made things happen while he played the part of the man who made the money. I kept track of the bills, even when they scared me. I called the insurance company every time we were overcharged. I scheduled our children's dentist appointments, remembered their teachers' names, packed lunches with notes folded like tiny prayers. He went to work, yes, but when he came home, his job ended. Mine never did. I was the keeper of everything, and no one noticed, because I did it well. That was my mistake. I made it all look too easy. He never asked how I managed when the baby had colic for 7 straight weeks. He never offered to stay up late so I could sleep. I remember once when I had the flu and was burning with fever, he came into the room and asked if I'd seen where he left his tennis shoes. I had. Of course I had. I told him they were in the closet by the dryer. He kissed my forehead and left. I stayed in bed and wept. You'd think after years of doing these things I'd get used to being invisible, but invisibility never stops hurting, it just gets quieter. There were days I longed for someone to see me, really see me, not as a fixture or a background presence, but as a woman whose efforts held the seams of this family together. And yet the more I did, the more they expected. Gratitude was something you gave to guests, not to mothers. Respect was saved for paychecks, not patience. My husband always said I was the strong one. He said it like it was a compliment, as if strength was a reward, not a survival mechanism. I was strong because I had to be. I was strong because he wouldn't bend, and someone had to. I swallowed my exhaustion, dressed it up in smiles, and carried on. I hosted Christmas even when my back ached. I drove to the pharmacy in ice storms. I kept the birthday cards stocked and the laundry folded and the fridge full of their favorite foods. And somewhere along the way, I disappeared into all the doing. He liked to brag about me to others, said I was the engine of the family. But he never lifted the hood to see how worn I was beneath the surface. He liked the idea of me, the wife who never forgot a birthday, the mother who always forgave, the woman who never complained. But he didn't know me, not really. And somewhere deep down, I think he preferred it that way. Knowing me might have forced him to question the comfort he'd built on my self-erasure. I remember watching him one evening as he napped in the recliner. Dinner was ready, the table was set, and he was snoring lightly, completely at ease. I stood there for a long moment, just watching him. I thought about all the ways I had made his comfort possible, all the years I had stretched myself so he wouldn't have to stretch at all, and I felt something rise in my chest, something like grief, something like fury. not because he had rested, but because he had assumed I never needed to. The truth is, I didn't mind doing the work. What I minded was that it never felt like love. Love notices. Love reciprocates. Love says, "Sit down. I've got this tonight." But what I had wasn't love anymore. It was obligation disguised as routine. And on that birthday night, when he handed me that necklace, it felt like the final proof that he still didn't see me. And maybe I hadn't let myself be seen. Maybe I'd been so committed to being dependable that I'd forgotten how to be human. But something was shifting now. I was tired of disappearing. I wanted someone to ask me what I needed, not what I could do for them. I wanted to stop pouring from a well that was almost dry. The necklace, the birthday, the silence. It was all pointing to the same truth. I had been the heart of a house that never once. If I was okay, and I was no longer willing to keep bleeding for people who didn't even know they were holding a knife. That night, after the dishwasher hummed its last cycle and the lights were dimmed, I sat in the quiet and said aloud, "No one asks what happens to the strong ones when they break." And for the first time in a long time, I answered myself, "They rebuild." But this time they do it for themselves. There's a strange kind of pride in being the one who holds it all together. The glue, the spine, the quiet foundation. People don't notice glue unless something falls apart, but I noticed. I felt every bit of myself that had been poured into other people. Every sacrifice, every swallowed word, every smile forced through exhaustion. I wore them like layers of armor, not because I wanted to be praised, but because I thought that's what love meant, staying fixing, enduring. I never thought to ask what it was costing me to be everyone's constant. I think about the time our son lost his job and moved back in. He was broken, then you could see it in his eyes. I cooked his meals, did his laundry, and talked him through the shame he wouldn't speak aloud. My husband barely noticed. He'd say things like, "He'll get back on his feet," while I was on my knees every night praying he would. When our daughter went through her divorce, it was me she called. Me, who dropped everything to stay with her, slept on her couch, helped raise her babies while she learned to breathe again. My husband sent a card. And when my sister died, my last living sibling, it was me who wrote the eulogy, me who handled the arrangements. He came to the funeral, yes, but he left early to beat the traffic. That was when I realized I was grieving more than my sister. I was grieving the fact that the man beside me had no idea how to hold me, not even in loss. Over the years, people started calling me strong, selfless, resilient. I never knew how to respond. Those words felt more like warnings than compliments. They meant, "You'll survive no matter what we do to you." And I did survive. I survived his passivity. I survived his absences. I survived the way he always had time for others, but never for me, not really. There were moments I tried to say something. I'd mention how tired I was, how lonely I felt, how much it would mean if he just offered to help without being asked. He'd say, "But you're so good at this," or "Just tell me what you need," as if needing to be told was the same as caring. He always needed instructions, like love was a task list, not a language you learn by heart. And the most maddening thing was he thought we were happy. He thought we had built something solid, but he didn't know the difference between a house that's still standing and one that's no longer a home. He couldn't hear the creaks in the floorboards or see the peeling at the edges. He only saw what I made sure he saw, a life that looked whole from the outside. When I turned 65, I was diagnosed with a heart condition. Nothing fatal, but it meant slowing down, being careful. I remember sitting with him in the doctor's office, hearing the words, and feeling a quiet panic rise in my chest. Not about death, but about care. Would he care? Would he show up if I couldn't be the glue anymore? He didn't. Not really. He drove me to appointments, yes, but he didn't sit through them. He waited in the car. He brought me meals, but only if I asked. He treated my illness like an interruption, not a warning. And I began to see clearly if I stopped holding things together, no one else would. Not him, not the children I'd raised to rely on me like air. They were kind, yes. They loved me in their way. But they had grown used to my invisibility, my giving, my silence. Being the glue meant I never got to fall apart, and now at 75, I didn't want to be the glue anymore. I didn't want to keep patching things with pieces of myself. I wanted someone else to notice the cracks and reach for the caulk. I wanted someone to look at me and say, "You've done enough. Rest." But no one did. Not then. Not at the party. Not the day after. Not once in the following week. Everyone went on assuming I'd keep doing what I'd always done. Assuming I'd put my feelings aside like leftover cake, wrap them up in plastic, and tuck them into the fridge for later. That week I sat down with a pen and paper and made 2 lists. One for everything I'd given, and one for everything I'd asked for. The second list was heartbreakingly short. Not because I hadn't needed things, but because I'd learned not to ask. Asking led to disappointment. So I became my own provider, my own therapist, my own support system. But that was no longer enough. I was done being the glue. I wanted to be the glass. Clear, fragile maybe, but visible, reflective. I wanted to be held, not just used to hold everything else in place. And that's when the seed of change took root, not out of rage, but out of quiet refusal. I wouldn't break for them anymore. If they wanted this family to stay whole, someone else would have to pick up the pieces. The thing about money is people pretend it's just numbers, just security, just practical, but it's more than that. Money carries memory. It carries power. And in our marriage, it carried a quiet inequality that neither of us wanted to name. For years, I believed the myth that as long as we shared everything, everything was fair. But fairness isn't about division. It's about recognition. And in our home, he always seemed to have the freedom while I carried the burden. I remember when my father died. It was sudden. He was gone before I could say goodbye. Amid the grief, the funeral, the closing up of his old house, there was the will. I inherited a modest piece of land and a small investment portfolio. Nothing extravagant, but enough to make life more comfortable. I hadn't expected it. My father was a simple man, but he'd worked hard to leave something behind for me, something of his own effort. I felt proud. I felt seen, until I brought it home. My husband didn't celebrate it with me. He didn't say, "This is yours," or "What do you want to do with it?" No. He looked over the papers and immediately began talking about we. We could finally redo the kitchen. We could add that sunroom. We could plan that Europe trip we've always talked about. And I just stood there holding the folder with my name on it, feeling it slip away. I didn't fight him. I wish I had. I wish I had said no. This is mine. But we're taught not to speak that way, aren't we? Taught to share, to blend, to merge, especially as women, especially as wives. And so I nodded. I agreed, and just like that, what was mine became his. And slowly, it became forgotten. We spent some of it on home improvements. He insisted on hiring the contractor he liked. I let him. He picked out the tiles. I paid the invoices. The land. We sold it. He said it was too far away to be useful. Said we could invest it into our future together. I listened. Because I thought that's what partners do, listen, compromise, merge dreams. But his dreams were always the ones we followed. And I watched over the years how my inheritance disappeared into things he called ours. But the decision-making, That was always his. When he wanted to buy a new car, he did. When I suggested I might go back to school just to learn something new, something for me, he laughed and said, at your age, not unkindly, just dismissively, the way people swat away dust without thinking. I had wanted to open a small community craft shop, just a hobby business really, a cozy place for older women to gather knit-share stories and sell their work. I had drawn up plans, visited rental spaces. I even met with a local accountant. I came home brimming with hope. He frowned. He said, "Are you sure that's the best use of your time and money?" I said nothing after that. I folded the idea away and told myself it wasn't practical, but it had been practical enough to dream. It's funny, he always assumed he was the provider, that because his paycheck came with a title and benefits, his role was foundational. But I provided too, in ways that were less visible, less measurable, but no less essential. And the one time something was given to me just for me, it was quietly absorbed into the marriage like water, into soil. No boundary, no question, just his needs, his preferences, his plans. I started keeping a small notebook after that, just a simple journal where I wrote down every financial decision we made and who initiated it. I wrote down the things I wanted but didn't ask for, the dreams I buried, the numbers I never spoke aloud, not to shame him, not even to confront him, just so I wouldn't forget. Because that's what was happening. I was forgetting that I mattered. And then came the day he bought himself a new set of golf clubs, top of the line, custom fitted. I didn't even know he'd ordered them. They arrived at the door in a sleek black case, and he opened it like a child on Christmas morning. I asked how much they cost. He waved his hand and said, "Don't worry about it, we had enough in the account." But it wasn't the money that stung. It was the fact that he hadn't asked, hadn't even thought to ask, that he still believed in this version of us, where I would be grateful just to be included in his world rather than asking to build one of my own. That night I took out the notebook. I read through the pages, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger exactly, but clarity. This marriage had not been a partnership. It had been a silent trade. His money for my labor, his preferences for my peace. And in the end, even when something was given to me, it somehow became another gift to him. But that was going to change. The money left in my name, the last bit of my father's legacy, was still untouched, hidden, quiet, mine. And I had begun to imagine what it might look like if I used it the way he never imagined I would not. For him, not for them, but for something beyond this family entirely. Something generous, but not to those who expected it. The more I thought about it, the more right it felt. I wasn't going to leave behind a nest for them to peck at. I was going to leave behind a message, one that said I existed, I chose, I gave. And when I finally stopped giving, I did it on my terms. For the longest time, I believed that my silence was a kind of love, that keeping the peace meant keeping us whole. I told myself that stability was worth the price of my unmet needs, that if the house didn't burn down, then the smoke in my lungs was a small price to pay. That's what sacrifice looked like to me, giving up a little more of myself each year, so that they could all rest easy, so that no one had to feel the discomfort of my truth. When the children were young, that made sense to me. I told myself they needed consistency, calm safety. I smoothed over their father's sharp edges, his absences, his forgetfulness. I filled in the blanks so they never had to see what was missing. If he forgot a birthday card, I signed one for him. If he raised his voice too loud, I became soft enough to absorb the shock. And when they asked me if we were happy, I said yes. Not because I believed it, but because I wanted them to. I became the architect of illusion. Not out of deception, but out of love. I thought I was building something strong, something solid. But I didn't see that the foundation was poured from my own exhaustion. That every time I said, "It's okay," when it wasn't, every time I picked up the slack without comment, I was reinforcing the idea that I didn't need help, that I didn't need to be cared for, that I was endless. They came to believe that I was unshakable, and I suppose to them I was. They never saw the nights I cried in the laundry room so no one would hear. They never knew how many holidays I spent wondering if anyone noticed that I never sat down. I kept everything humming: birthdays, anniversaries, back-to-school shopping tax season. And when I was praised, it was for how well I managed, never for how much it cost me. Even my friends would say things like, "You're so lucky your husband lets you run the show," as if autonomy was a gift handed down by a benevolent man, as if my competence was permitted, not earned. And when I talk about my fatigue, about the imbalance, about the loneliness of always being the dependable one, they'd laugh and say, "That's just how men are," or "At least he's not cheating or drinking," as if the bar for partnership was simply absence of catastrophe. But that kind of thinking, that quiet lowering of expectations, it becomes a noose. You stop hoping for more. You settle into your role like a piece of old furniture, grateful just to be useful. And you tell yourself this is what a good life looks like: quiet, predictable, uncomplaining. Yet inside the silence gets heavier. There was one moment, I don't even know why it stuck with me, when I asked him if he'd ever considered writing me a letter. We were watching television, and I'd just seen some character reading a love letter, old and crinkled with time. Something about it stirred something in me. I turned to him and said, "Have you ever thought about writing to me?" And he chuckled, said, "Why would I write to someone I live with?" And just like that, the moment passed. He went back to his show. I went back to folding laundry, but something inside me curled up and stayed there. Because what I'd really been asking was, do you ever see me when I'm not serving you? When I'm not smoothing things over? When I'm not being the glue? The truth is, I had trained them all, him, the kids, even myself, to believe that I was fine, as long as the house was quiet and the bills were paid. I disguised sacrifice as stability so well that no one questioned it. Not even me. Until now. Because what my 75th birthday showed me wasn't just that they didn't see me, it was that I had disappeared. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a little at a time, like water evaporating. And the only person who could reclaim me was me. The thought terrified me. It still does. Change at this age feels almost like blasphemy. We're taught to endure, to be grateful, to count blessings instead of boundaries. But I had reached the edge of myself. And standing there, I didn't want to hold the structure up anymore. I wanted to walk away and let it all fall, just to see what survived, without my constant holding. So I began doing the unthinkable. I started saying no, just once at first. When he asked me to call the tax preparer, I said, "You can do it this year." When my daughter assumed I'd host Thanksgiving again, I told her she should host it instead. I'd be a guest this time. And their surprise, their confusion. It told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't even realized how much I'd been doing, because I'd made it look effortless, because I thought that was love. But love doesn't ask you to vanish. Love doesn't rely on your silence to function. I wasn't angry. I was awake. And waking up even after decades of sleep is still a beginning. I've heard many toasts in my life, wedding toasts, retirement toasts, even a few awkward ones at baby showers. But I never expected that the one meant for me on the night of my 75th birthday would feel like the final flicker of a candle burning out. He stood up with his glass raised, everyone watching him, the room quiet with anticipation. And in that hush, I held my breath, not because I expected something poetic, but because I hoped for something personal. He cleared his throat and smiled that same smile he wore in photographs, a little stiff practice, the kind you put on for show. He started with a joke about my age. Harmless, I suppose. Something about still looking good for 75. A few chuckles. Then he moved into the usual script, how lucky he was to have me, how strong I'd been through the years, how much I meant to the family. But none of it reached me. The words floated like helium balloons, bright and empty. Not once did he mention a memory. Not once did he say my name with affection. Not once did I feel like he was talking about me, and not just the idea of me. It was like listening to someone read a Wikipedia summary of a woman I used to be. He said I was the backbone of the family, the reason the children turned out well, the reason the house always felt warm. But even in those words, I heard it admiration without intimacy, gratitude without depth. He could praise what I'd done, but not who I was. And that distinction, subtle as it was, shattered something inside me. Because here he was, speaking to a room of people I had fed, held forgiven, celebrated, and yet I felt lonelier than I had ever felt in my life. I felt like a framed photograph being described instead of a living woman being loved. His toast lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes to sum up 75 years, and when he was done, everyone clapped, smiled, raised their glasses. I smiled too. I even nodded, but inside something curled in on itself. I thought about what I would have said if it were me giving a toast for him. I would have told a story, the one where he helped me build the garden fence in our first home, how we laughed when it collapsed, and built it again with sore backs and muddy shoes. I would have said how I used to watch him read to the children with his glasses slipping down his nose, and how it made me fall in love with him all over again. I would have talked about the real things, the tender things, the things that mattered. But he didn't remember those moments. Or if he did, he didn't think to share them. And maybe that was the worst part, realizing that the story I had been living wasn't the same one he'd been telling himself. I had given him the best parts of me, and he had memorized only the outline. Later, after the guests had thinned and the room was quieter, I stood by the kitchen door watching him load empty bottles into a recycling bag. He looked up at me and said, "That went well, don't you think?" I nodded, but I wanted to say, "You didn't see me. You never really did." The truth is, I don't think he meant to hurt me. He probably thought he was being kind, polished, respectful. But that was the problem. I didn't want polish. I wanted presence. I wanted to feel like I mattered, not because I'd endured, but because I was still here, still breathing, still needing, still real. I went to bed that night without saying much. He kissed my forehead and turned off the lamp rolled onto his side like he always did, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how many other women had been toasted like that, praised for being useful, strong, devoted, but never once asked, "Who are you really?" The next morning I couldn't stop replaying his speech in my head. The phrases he used, always dependable, never complains, the glue, as if my silence was the thing they cherished most, as if my worth was in how well I'd disappeared. I walked out to the garden with my coffee and sat in the old wicker chair he'd once promised to replace, but never did, and I realized something. I had spent so much time making sure everyone else's stories stayed intact that I had let mine be written by someone else. And that toast, that was the moment I heard it out loud for the first time, the version of me that existed in his mind, a version that was pleasant, predictable, passive. But I was none of those things, not really. I was tired, yes, but I was also wise. I was full of longing. I had dreams that still lived quietly beneath my skin. I had resentment, yes, but also the capacity for joy if only someone had bothered to ask where it lived. That day I took out a notebook and started writing my own toast, not for anyone else, just for me. I wrote the things I wished someone had said. You are still becoming. You are allowed to want more. You are not just what you've given. You are what you've endured, what you've dreamed, and what you still have left to claim. And as I wrote, I felt something shift again. A little less sadness, a little more certainty. I didn't need a stage or a room full of applause. I needed truth, and if no one else would give it to me, then I would give it to myself. The day after the party, the house was quiet again. The balloons hung limp by the curtains, and the flowers so carefully arranged for the celebration already began to sag. I moved through the silence like a ghost, picking up discarded plates and napkins, wiping down countertops that no one thanked me for cleaning. But my hands were slower than usual. My mind kept wandering, not to the party, not to the guests, but to the list I had begun writing in my head, the one that wouldn't leave me alone. It started innocently enough. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen, the same notebook I used to write grocery lists and budget notes. I wrote at the top, things I gave. I didn't mean money at first. I meant time, energy, years. But the categories began to blur. I wrote, every Christmas cooked alone, every birthday planned by me, 3 years of care during his mother's illness, 17 loads of laundry a week average, 92 doctor's appointments scheduled not for me, countless dinners reheated because he was late, forgiveness when he forgot anniversaries, patience when I was the only one listening. And on it went. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry. I was stunned. Stunned at how much I had given without thinking, how many pieces of my life had been silently carved away to feed the needs of others. Not because they asked maliciously, but because they never thought to ask at all. Then I flipped to a clean page and wrote, what I received. I stared at the blank page for a long time. Of course he had done things, provided, taken me on vacations, fixed things around the house when I reminded him enough. But I wasn't measuring deeds. I was measuring presence, effort, thoughtfulness, and that page, it stayed mostly empty. I began to understand that what I had called love had too often been a ledger, a silent, imbalanced book of effort versus expectation. And I had been the accountant no one ever noticed reconciling the emotional overdrafts they didn't even know they were writing. I thought about the years I stayed home with the kids. We agreed it made sense. His job paid more. Mine could wait. And I told myself it was a joint decision. But it was my career that never restarted. It was my ambition that dried up like rainwater on pavement. He never asked what it cost me. And when I brought it up years later, he said, "But you loved being a mother, didn't you?" As if that made everything even. As if that paid back the dreams I left behind. I began adding to the notebook every day. Little things, things no one else would consider noteworthy. Did his laundry without asking. Gave up the master bathroom so he could have more counter space. Stayed home from my college reunion to help with his work trip. Smiled through holidays with his cousins who never remembered my name. Each entry was like a pebble. Small on its own, but together they became a mountain. Then one evening, I did something I had never done. I pulled up the financial account tied to my father's inheritance. The one I had kept separate, untouched, quiet. I looked at the number. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to do something with. Enough to mean something. And that's when the idea started forming, not out of spite, but from something deeper, a need to take back what had been given away too easily. I thought, what if I didn't leave it to them, not out of anger, but as an act of truth? What if I used it to tell my own story, to say in the clearest way I could, I mattered. My choices mattered. My life was not just a support beam for theirs. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about seeing myself clearly for the first time in decades, not as someone bitter or broken, but as someone who had quietly kept score because no one else had ever done it for her. I looked around the house and realized how much of it had my fingerprints. The curtains I chose, the photographs I framed, the meals I made not once or twice, but thousands of times. This life had been shaped by my hands, and yet the credit, the recognition had always drifted toward him like smoke rising from someone else's fire. And that's when I knew the money would not go to the people who had come to expect it. It would not be their reward for years of neglect, disguised as normalcy. It would be my voice, my final undeniable act of visibility. So I closed the notebook, not with bitterness, with clarity. I wasn't asking for them to repay what they had never counted. I was simply choosing to stop contributing to a system where my worth was measured in silence. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet and pale, the kind of morning that made you feel like the world was still holding its breath. I woke early before he did and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I watched the light spill across the floorboards, soft and unbothered, and I felt something in me settle. Not a peace exactly, not yet, but a readiness, a quiet, solid readiness to do what I had been circling around for weeks. I had the lawyer's number in my desk drawer, buried beneath old receipts and greeting cards. He had been my father's attorney, a kind man, with a gentle voice, who always called me ma'am even after all these years. I hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, but I found the card, ran my thumb over the embossed letters, and picked up the phone. My voice didn't shake when I asked for an appointment. I thought it would, but it didn't. Maybe because I had already made the decision days ago in the still hours of early morning, after reading back through everything I had written in my notebook. He welcomed me into his office with tea chamomile. He remembered I never drank coffee. That meant more to me than it should have. He listened as I explained what I wanted. I told him I was updating my will. I told him it was time I made some changes. He didn't ask why, just nodded kindly and asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told him plainly I would not be leaving my inheritance to my husband, nor to my children, not because I hated them, not because I wished them harm, but because they had already taken so much of me without ever asking if I had anything left to give. I told him I had found an organization, a foundation for women over 60, helping them start small businesses, gain financial independence, rebuild after long marriages that left them erased. Women like me, women I understood. I wanted the money to go there, all of it. He raised an eyebrow only slightly. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm more sure of this than I've been about anything in years." There was something liberating about saying it aloud, as if the moment I spoke those words I became real again. Not a role, not a title, but a woman making a choice that belonged only to her. We worked through the details. He guided me through every clause. I signed papers with a steady hand. The pen felt heavier than I expected. Every stroke across the page felt like a reclaiming, and when it was done, he looked at me, really looked at me and said, "Good for you." I think I nearly cried, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, with recognition, with respect, like he knew what this meant, like he saw the story behind the signature. Afterward, I went home and sat at the dining table, the place where birthdays had been celebrated, where holidays were hosted, where plans were made for everyone but me. I took out a sheet of paper and began writing a letter. Not to my family, not yet. That would come later. This letter was to myself. I wrote, "You did not imagine the weight. You carried it. You did not ask for permission. You found your voice. You do not owe them more just because you gave them everything once. You are not cruel. You are clear. You are not selfish. You are sovereign. This choice does not erase your love. It defines your boundary. You gave and gave. Now you choose. I folded that letter and tucked it into the back of my journal, not because I needed proof, but because I wanted a reminder. For the moments when doubt would inevitably come. For the moments when someone would say, "But why didn't you just tell us how you felt?" as if I hadn't been telling them in 1,000 ways they refused to hear. I knew they wouldn't understand. Not at first. Maybe not ever. I knew they'd feel betrayed, confused, wounded. But I had spent a lifetime cushioning their feelings while mine lay bare. This time I wasn't going to soften the blow. This time I was going to let the truth fall where it may. That night I cooked dinner as usual. He asked if I'd done something different with the roast. I said, "No, same as always." But the truth was I'd added a little more rosemary, a little more of something that made it mine. He didn't notice, but I did. It was my small rebellion, my quiet celebration. When we sat down to eat, I looked across the table at the man I had spent over 50 years beside. I saw the wear in his eyes, the thinning of his hair, the slow heaviness in his body. I didn't hate him. I didn't even resent him anymore. I simply saw him for who he was and for who I had been forced to become alongside him, and I felt not pity, not anger, but distance, a widening space that was no longer painful, just honest. I had signed the will. I had made the call. I had written the letter. And something inside me had shifted, like I had finally stood up after sitting in a small chair for far too long, like I had opened a window in a house that had gone stale, like I had remembered the sound of my own voice. And for the first time in years, I slept with the bedroom window cracked open, and the night air felt like freedom. The letter confirming the final transfer came 2 weeks later, a manila envelope thick and official stamped with the name of the foundation I'd chosen. I held it in my lap before opening it, the weight of it both literal and symbolic. It was done. No longer a thought, no longer a private act of defiance scribbled in a notebook. It was real now, legally binding, irrevocable. I had taken the money that everyone assumed would be theirs, and I gave it to strangers, or rather to women I had never met but knew intimately. It wasn't revenge. I want to say that clearly. It wasn't an act of spite. If anything, it was an act of preservation. I had spent most of my life turning myself inside out for people who mistook my giving for guarantee, who believed that because I had always said yes, I always would. But this money, this last thread of my independence, deserved to live somewhere it would matter, somewhere it wouldn't be dissolved into more of their comfort or taken for granted like I had been. The foundation sent a handwritten note from one of the directors. She had read my request personally. I had written a short letter to accompany the funds, just a few sentences. I said, "This is for women like me, women who gave everything and forgot they were allowed to want something back. May this help them build something that is entirely, beautifully theirs." The director wrote, "You've reminded us what dignity looks like. We won't waste a cent. And more importantly, we won't forget the name that gave it." I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time. I'd grown so used to being thanked in passing, praised for endurance, never for choice. This was different. This was someone seeing the act not as a donation, but as a statement, not as generosity, but as reclamation. That night I went into the closet and found the necklace he gave me, still in its box. I opened it, looked at the shine, the hollowness of it. A gift that looked nice but said nothing. I thought of mailing it to the foundation too, But then I realized, no, let it stay here. A relic, a symbol of what I almost settled for, what I almost accepted as love. I placed it in the back of my drawer and wrote a note on top, "This is not my legacy." My real legacy now lived in programs I would never see. It lived in a woman walking into a bank, applying for her first small business loan with a confidence she thought she'd never feel again. It lived in the late-blooming courage of someone who thought her life had passed her by and now suddenly saw possibility blooming in her hands. It lived in freedom, passed from one quiet woman to another. I didn't tell my husband yet. I didn't owe him that, not yet. I wasn't ready for the questions, the confusion, the inevitable disbelief. I wanted to sit with my choice first, like sipping a warm drink slowly, after years of being handed cold ones. For the next few days, I went about my routines almost normally, but everything felt different, like I was inhabiting my own skin again, for the first time in decades. When I watered the plants, I hummed. When I folded laundry, I did it without resentment. Not because I loved the task, but because I had done something just for me. I had righted a scale that had been tipping for too long. The smallest moments felt like small rebellions, peaceful ones. One afternoon, I went to the market by myself. I bought a pastry and sat on a bench in the sun, something I hadn't done since I was a much younger woman. And I thought, I have given them everything. And now finally, I have given something to myself. That's the thing about dignity. It's quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't shout. But when it returns to you, it fills every room you walk into. It changes how you carry your shoulders, how you meet your own reflection, how you speak not with volume, but with truth. I knew the storm would come, when the will was read, when the questions started, when the disbelief gave way to accusations. But I wasn't afraid of that anymore. Let them call me ungrateful. Let them say I was harsh. Let them invent a version of me that made it easier for them to feel innocent. I'd spent too many years being palatable. This act, this choice, wasn't about hurting them. It was about finally respecting myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam doors. I simply made a choice they never imagined I was capable of. And in doing so, I found something they couldn't take from me. This wasn't charity, not really. This was dignity, redirected, reclaimed, returned. And for the first time in years, I felt rich. It was Sunday dinner, as always. Roast chicken, roasted carrots with thyme, and the usual soft rolls from the bakery down the street. I set the table for 6, though only 4 would show up. My son and his wife arrived first, bringing their boys, who immediately darted off to the living room for cartoons. My daughter came next alone this time, her husband away on a business trip again. My husband poured wine like he always did, humming out of tune and making small talk about the news. It all felt ordinary, utterly suffocatingly ordinary. Until the envelope. I'd placed it in the center of the table between the serving dishes where no one could miss it. White, sealed, neat. I didn't say anything. I just sat down, napkin in lap, hand steady. They noticed it soon enough. "What's this, Mom?" my daughter asked, reaching for it, looking confused but casual. "A letter," I said. "Something I thought you should all read together." There was a pause. Forks poised mid-air. My son frowned, eyes darting to his wife, who looked equally uncertain. My husband, bless his obliviousness, smiled and said, "Well, I hope it's not your famous holiday schedule. You know how I feel about too many plans." "No," I said, "it's not a schedule." She opened it. Her eyes moved across the page. At first she looked puzzled, her brow furrowing. Then I saw the shift. Her posture straightened. Her mouth opened slightly as if trying to find the right words and finding none. She passed it to her brother. He read it faster with growing speed, his face reddening by degrees. My husband reached for it last. His hands shook slightly. He read slower than the rest. When he looked up, he didn't speak right away, just stared at me like I was someone he'd never really known. "You gave it away," he said, voice low, almost incredulous. "All of it." I nodded. "To a charity," my son said louder now, his voice catching, "instead of your own family." I took a sip of water, then answered. "I gave it to women who need it, women like I was, who gave and gave until they were forgotten. I didn't forget them. I won't let them be invisible." My daughter looked stunned. "But Mom, that money wasn't it for us." "Was it?" I asked gently. "Or did you just assume?" There was a pause thick enough to chew. No one moved. The only sound was the clink of a fork, as one of the boys, unaware, tapped it against his plate in the next room. "You should have told us," my husband said, softer now, but with that edge of wounded pride I'd come to know so well. "I tried," I replied, "for years, not with legal language or drama. I tried by showing you I was tired, that I needed to be seen, that I needed something back. None of you ever asked what I wanted. You just assumed I'd always give." My son shook his head, face pinched. "This feels like a punishment." "No," I said. "It's a decision, mine. One of the only ones I've made just for myself." The rest of the meal happened sort of. They picked at their food. The conversation when it came was stilted. My daughter asked a few more questions, some veiled in concern, others in disbelief. My son kept glancing at his wife, who stared at the wall like it had answers. My husband didn't speak again. Afterward, when they left, no one lingered in the kitchen like they used to. No offers to help with the dishes, no kisses on the cheek, just silence, heavy, dense. I washed the dishes slowly, feeling my heartbeat in my fingertips. I expected a sense of guilt to rise up to settle in my throat, but it didn't. Instead, I felt light, not happy, but untethered, like I had finally taken off a coat I didn't realize I'd been wearing for 50 years. Later that night, my husband sat in his recliner staring at the dark television screen. He didn't say much, just sat there, breathing through his nose, hands clasped on his lap. "I thought we had a good life," he said finally. "We did," I said. "A quiet one, a stable one. But it was built on me disappearing a little more each year." He didn't argue. Maybe he knew better. Maybe he didn't know what to say. And for once I didn't fill the silence for him. I went to bed before him that night. I closed the door softly behind me, sat on the edge of the bed, and exhaled the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. The aftershock didn't crush me. It clarified me. They now knew who I was beneath the roles I had played, and they would have to decide what to do with that. But their confusion, their disappointment, it wasn't my burden anymore. I had done what I needed to do. And for the first time in my life, I didn't apologize for it. The word divorce used to sound like an explosion to me, dramatic, loud, a rupture, the end of something that once pulsed with love. But when I finally decided to leave, it wasn't like that at all. There was no yelling, no broken plates, no slammed doors, just stillness. A long, quiet stillness, like the space after the last note of a song lingers in the air. It happened a few weeks after Sunday dinner. The silence in the house had deepened, but not in a bitter way, more like a recognition, like we had finally run out of illusions to share. He moved around the rooms like a man rehearsing a part he no longer believed in. I did too. We still made the bed each morning. We still passed each other the salt. But something fundamental had shifted. We no longer pretended this was enough. It was early morning when I told him. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same place we'd planned our vacations, signed the mortgage papers, eaten hundreds of meals with the children. I poured his coffee not out of habit, but as a parting kindness. He looked older than he had a month ago, or maybe I was finally seeing him as he truly was tired, uncertain, and full of a quiet fear he would never name. "I'm going to leave," I said, setting down the sugar bowl. He didn't look up right away, just stared into the steam curling from his mug. "Leave," he echoed. "As in—" "Yes," I said softly. "The marriage, this house. I want something else now." He nodded. Once, twice. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Finally, he said, after all these years, "Yes," I replied. "Because of all these years." I thought he might argue, try to pull me back with old promises or regrets, but he didn't. Maybe he knew deep down that I had already left in the ways that mattered. My heart had gone quiet in this house long before my feet would follow. "I don't know how to be alone," he said after a while. I reached across the table, placed my hand over his. "Neither do I. But I think I'd rather learn now than keep living like this." He nodded again. There were no accusations, no begging, just two people acknowledging that the rope they'd pulled on for decades had frayed too far to repair. That's the thing about quiet divorces. They don't come from hatred. They come from emptiness, from years of small cuts, from kindnesses, withheld questions, unasked affection that slowly turns into assumption. I called the same lawyer. He handled it with grace. No battles, no drama. The finances were easy. We each had our own now. There were no custody arrangements, no house to fight over. The children were grown, and the walls had grown too cold to care about. Telling the children was harder. My daughter cried. My son didn't say much, just asked if I was sure. I told them both the same thing: I stayed long enough to raise you. Now I'm raising myself. I rented a small cottage on the edge of town. Just 2 rooms, a garden out front, and windows that drank in the morning light. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I furnished it slowly. A soft chair by the fireplace, a quilt for the bed, a small table where I drank tea and watched the sparrows in the hedges. And in that quiet, I began to breathe again. At first, I didn't know what to do with all the stillness. There were no lists to make, no one to cook for, no errands that weren't mine. I found myself standing in the middle of my own life, not quite knowing where to begin, but I didn't rush it. I let the silence be a teacher. I started reading again, real reading, not skimming through magazines while dinner burned. I joined a small book club at the library full of women with stories like mine. Wounds like mine, laughter like mine. I planted herbs in the garden and watched them sprout, surprised by how proud I felt over something so small. He called once, just once, said he missed the sound of my footsteps in the hallway. I told him I understood, that I miss some things too, but missing something is not a reason to keep it. I didn't leave with fireworks. I left with grace, with the same quiet strength I had used to hold the marriage together for years. But now, that strength belonged to me. It's odd being alone after so long. At night, the silence stretches wide, but I don't fill it with television or worry. I let it be. Sometimes I cry. Sometimes I smile without knowing why. But more often now, I sleep without waking in the middle of the night, heart pounding with the weight of everything unspoken. I thought divorce would feel like failure, but it didn't. It felt like correction, like stepping off a path that had narrowed too far to walk anymore, like choosing to stop apologizing for wanting more. In this new space, I don't ask for permission. I don't explain myself. I write letters I don't send. I make tea the way I like it. I sit in the sun until I'm warm, and I don't move until I'm ready. This wasn't the life they expected me to have at 75, but it's the one I chose. The day I left, I packed slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel every corner of the house one last time. I moved through the rooms not as their caretaker, but as a visitor, as someone gathering pieces of her past, deciding what to carry forward and what to lay gently down. I opened drawers I hadn't touched in years, found photo albums I had forgotten existed. So many smiling faces, so many captured moments that now felt like artifacts from a life I no longer inhabited. There was the picture of our wedding tucked behind a stack of old bills. I looked young in it, startlingly young, full of belief, holding his hand like it was a promise. I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb and whispered, "She tried." I put it back, not out of anger, but out of reverence. She had built something, even if it didn't last the way she hoped. The house didn't fight me as I packed. It was almost as if it knew I needed to go. The walls held my echoes, but none tried to hold me. I boxed up only what was mine: my mother's china, my books, the yellow sweater I always wore on rainy days. I left behind the things that belonged to the version of me who said yes to everything, the woman who made herself small for the sake of peace. When I reached the hallway closet, I found the Christmas decorations, tinsel garlands, ornaments collected over 5 decades. I sat on the floor and held a ceramic angel in my lap, the one we always placed at the top of the tree. I remembered the first year we bought it. He had picked it out, said it reminded him of me. Back then, I believed him. Maybe he even meant it. But the years had a way of sanding off sincerity, leaving only ritual. I closed the box and left it behind. I didn't take furniture, only my armchair, the one with the faded fabric and worn arms, where I had read countless bedtime stories, where I had waited up for the kids when they were late, where I had nursed my grief quietly when no one noticed. That chair was mine. It had shaped to me, and it came with me. He didn't try to stop me. When I walked out the front door, suitcase in hand, he was in the living room, sitting in his usual chair, staring at the blank television. He didn't ask where I was going, just looked at me like he might finally understand. I nodded once. He nodded back. That was all. The house didn't follow me. It stayed where it had always been, full of echoes of birthday candles, of sleepless nights, of silences longer than arguments. But it was no longer my home, not because I was leaving it physically, but because I had already left emotionally a long time ago. Home is where you feel seen, heard, held. That house had stopped being that for me years ago. At the cottage, I placed the armchair near the window. The light fell perfectly there in the afternoons. I placed a small table beside it with a single coaster and a lamp. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, entirely mine. I lit a candle, a soft scent of sandalwood and lavender, the kind he never liked, said it gave him headaches. I let it burn until the whole room smelled like freedom. I didn't cry that first night. I thought I might. I thought grief would wrap itself around me. But it didn't. Instead, I stood in the doorway and said aloud, "I'm here." Just those 2 words, as if introducing myself to the woman who had waited decades for this moment. Over the next few days, I settled in. Slowly. I hung one painting, a quiet meadow, soft brushstrokes, endless sky. I wrote in my journal every morning, just a few lines, nothing profound, just truth. I woke up with silence and felt no guilt. I made tea and added honey, not because someone else likes it, but because I do. I looked in the mirror and didn't wince. I saw someone who survived. And still there were moments, fleeting ones, where a song would come on the radio and transport me to a kitchen full of laughter, or the scent of roasting chicken would remind me of Sunday dinners, where a certain crack in the floor would echo in my memory. But those weren't regrets. They were reminders, proof that I had lived, that I had loved, that I had built something, even if it didn't last. I didn't need to hate the house I left. I just needed to honor the woman who had finally found the strength to walk out of it. Because leaving wasn't betrayal. It was return to myself, to the small, soft voice that had been whispering all along, you don't have to stay, just because you've always been here. And now here I was, in a home made by my own hands, small, quiet, honest. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. I had walked away, and I had survived. In the stillness of the cottage, I began writing letters, not to be mailed, not to be read aloud, just for me. They poured out of me like water finally finding the crack in the dam. Some were angry, some tender, some so quiet I could barely hear them in my own head until they spilled onto the page. But every letter had one thing in common. They were all the words I had swallowed for decades. The first was to him, my husband, the man I had walked beside for over 50 years. I began it simply. You never meant to forget me, but you did. I wrote about the dinners he barely thanked me for, the birthdays he reduced to store-bought cards and last-minute gestures. I told him how I used to wait for him to notice the new book I was reading, the scarf I'd knitted, the tremble in my hands when I was tired, how I used to wonder if he even knew the color of my eyes. I reminded him of the nights I cried quietly facing the wall so I wouldn't disturb his sleep. I told him that I had loved him, but that love alone is not enough when it is never returned in full. The second was to my children. That one was harder. It came out in fits like a faucet with rusted threads. I gave you everything I had, I wrote, but I gave it so quietly that you forgot I was ever offering something. I told them how proud I was of the adults they had become, but also how tired I had grown from carrying the weight of their expectations. I reminded them that mothers are not machines. We do not run on duty alone. I wanted them to know that while I would always love them, I was no longer willing to disappear for them. Then came the letters to people long gone, my sister, my mother, friends I had lost touch with through the years. I told them I missed them, that I often wished for their voices in the silence. I asked them if they would have understood what I had done, if they would have supported me, told me I was brave. I imagined they would have. That thought was enough to make the grief ache, but also soothe it. I even wrote one to myself, not the woman I had become, but the woman I had been young, hopeful, so eager to do it all right. I told her, you did your best, you loved well. You held on longer than you should have, but that doesn't make you weak. That makes you human. And now, finally, you are free. I kept the letters in a wooden box I found at a thrift store. It was carved with tiny flowers worn smooth on the edges. I lined the inside with velvet, the softest blue. Every time I added a letter, I folded it carefully as if it were fragile. Because it was. These were the pieces of my life that had never had a voice, until now. Sometimes I reread them, not to dwell, but to remember, to make sure I didn't fall back into silence. They reminded me of the journey, of the cost, of the slow erosion of self that happens when you're always the last name on your own list. One morning, as the sun slanted through the curtains, I sat with the box open on my lap. I read the letter to my husband again. This time I wasn't angry. I was grateful, because without his neglect, I might never have found the boundaries I needed to draw. Without his absence, I might never have heard my own voice echoing back at me through the void. I thought briefly of sending one of the letters, maybe to my daughter, but I folded it and placed it back in the box. Some truths don't need to be handed over to be real. Some truths are for the keeper alone. The act of writing had done something to me, not just emotionally, but physically. My chest felt lighter, my breath slower. I no longer felt like I was carrying a backpack full of unsaid things. The weight had shifted. The words had made it out. And in a strange way, those letters made me feel more connected to the world than I had in years. Not because anyone was reading them, but because I had finally read myself. Each letter was a mirror, and I had looked into every one without flinching. There is something sacred in saying the thing you never dared say, even if the only ears that hear it are your own. And maybe in the end, that's the kind of closure we really need. Not apologies, not validation, but the courage to tell ourselves the truth and let it sit there, fully seen, fully heard. I closed the box, tied it with a small ribbon, and placed it on the shelf beside the window. The light caught the edge of the wood just right. It looked like something holy. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need to send the letters. I had already lived them. It was an afternoon like any other wind, tapping gently at the windows, the sky heavy with soft gray clouds, but inside me something had finished unraveling, and not in the way things fall apart. No, this was the unraveling of a knot that had long kept me tethered to an identity that no longer fit. I stood in the mirror, brushing my thinning silver hair back from my face, and realized I was no longer anyone's anything. Not someone's wife, not someone's mother in the way I had been. I was simply myself. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The calls had slowed. The initial wave of confusion and disappointment had receded into a strange kind of distance. My children didn't understand, not fully. I think they wanted to, but they were still too hurt by what I had taken from them, or rather by what I had chosen not to leave behind. And that's the truth. No one likes to admit people don't miss you. They miss what you gave them. I had been the giver, the fixer, the background music to their lives. And now, in the quiet that followed my exit, they had to sit with the silence I left behind. That silence was my final gift. My husband never asked me to come back. He mailed me the last few things I'd forgotten: my winter coat, a photograph of my sister and me from years ago. No note, just things wrapped carefully. I took that as a kind of apology, not in words, but in action. That was all we ever had, really. Unspoken transactions. There was no revenge in what I did. I need to say that again. I didn't leave to hurt them. I left because I had finally recognized that I had been living on crumbs, emotional leftovers, the kind of love that only shows up when asked. And I was done asking. It's funny how people assume the one who leaves must be running towards something. A new man, a new life, some secret plan. But I wasn't running toward anything. I was walking away, slowly, deliberately, with nothing in my hands but my own self-respect. There's a strange kind of power in leaving empty-handed. It means you were never staying for what they gave you. You were staying out of hope or fear or duty. But when you leave with nothing and feel more whole than ever, you know it was the right decision. I no longer waited for their approval. I no longer rehearsed explanations in my head. I didn't owe anyone a polished story. I didn't need to make myself palatable. I had stepped off the stage, walked out the back door, and started over as quietly as I had lived. In the evenings now, I light a candle and sit in my armchair. I read or write or simply look out the window. No noise, no requests, no compromises, just me. And sometimes when the wind is just right, I imagine them back in the old house, sitting at the same table, passing dishes. One of them might ask, "Do you remember the way she used to?" and then trail off. Maybe they remember how much I gave. Maybe they miss it. Maybe they don't. But I'm not there to soften the edges anymore. I don't regret loving them. I don't regret staying as long as I did. I regret only that it took me so long to realize that love should not cost your identity. It should not require you to vanish piece by piece. Now I don't vanish, I appear. When I walk into a room, I do not carry the weight of everyone else's needs. I carry my name, my choices, my quiet freedom. I have nothing left to give them. And that is exactly what saved me.